A France soldier tried to assassinate Ibrahim Traoré. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of the month. Subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream too. The sky over Paris was grey, heavy with the threat of rain, as President Ibrahim Traoré's armored convoy moved silently along a restricted military corridor near Mont-Valérien. It was meant to be a diplomatic visit, a quiet exchange of ideas about military cooperation between African nations and European forces. But hidden behind layers of protocol and courtesy, the unease was palpable. In one of the lead vehicles, Traoré sat, dressed not in his traditional fatigues but in a sharply cut diplomatic suit, his calm demeanor barely concealing the tension he sensed. As the convoy passed under a stone arch, a sudden flicker caught the attention of his chief of security, but the moment passed, too fast to be sure. And yet, Ibrahim's eyes narrowed. Back at Élysée, someone had warned him, "There are people here who smile while aiming at your heart." He hadn't told anyone except his aide, a brilliant but cautious intelligence officer named Maury Diallo. Diallo had intercepted chatter the night before, a possible internal breach in the French military, with one rogue soldier allegedly paid by a private entity tied to arms trafficking in Africa. Still, without concrete proof, they moved forward, believing tight protocol and bulletproof glass would suffice. But Traoré, a soldier long before a president, knew one thing. Betrayal often came wearing a friend's badge. As the convoy slowed near a checkpoint manned by French soldiers, something snapped. A figure in uniform stepped out of formation, not aggressively, not suspiciously at first. His rifle was lowered, his face unreadable. But then came the movement, too quick, too fluid. Traoré saw it. The subtle shift in the soldier's grip, the angle of the elbow, the way he stepped left, not as a guard, but as an executioner. Time slowed. Maury screamed, "Down!" But the gun was already rising, and a red dot glowed for a fraction of a second on the window. And then, Traoré moved. He didn't duck, he leapt. Years of battlefield instinct surged as he tackled his driver, dragging them both into the footwell just as a deafening crack tore through the quiet corridor. The sound shattered the windshield, and everything became chaos. Alarms blared. Soldiers shouted. The traitor was tackled within seconds, but the bullet had already flown. It missed by inches. Traoré, breath heaving, pushed himself up, blood on his temple from shattered glass, but alive. Outside, soldiers scrambled. Inside, Traoré met Maury's eyes. "We were right," he said, voice low, fury rising. "It has begun." The soldier who fired the shot lay pinned under 4 heavily armed guards, his face pressed against the wet asphalt. His expression wasn't that of fear, but eerie calm. Traoré stepped out of the vehicle slowly, blood trickling down the side of his face, his jacket torn, eyes burning with restrained fury. "Who gave the order?" he demanded, voice unwavering. The soldier remained silent. His badge had been ripped from his chest, but his accent gave him away. He wasn't French-born. "Who sent you?" Traoré repeated, now standing directly over him. Still silence. Then the soldier smirked and muttered, "Check the minister's call logs." Within moments, Maury Diallo had 2 units moving. One to secure the convoy and reroute to a fortified embassy safehouse, and another to quietly intercept all communications from the French Ministry of Defense. No one was to speak publicly about the attack yet. "We have eyes in the wrong places," Maury whispered, handing Traoré a burner phone. "This wasn't just some radical soldier. This smells like politics, or worse, corporate sabotage." Traoré nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew too well that coups no longer came from men with guns. They came from boardrooms, lobbies, and foreign contracts. Hours later, in a discreet underground intelligence room beneath the African embassy in Paris, the soldier sat restrained. What they found in his belongings made everyone's blood run cold: encrypted USBs, maps of Traoré's route for the last 3 days, and worst of all, payment records from a powerful French energy conglomerate that had recently lost mining rights in Burkina Faso. It's retaliation, Mori said. They lost billions in your new resource protection law. And now, they're fighting back the only way they know how, eliminate you. Traoré looked at the screen showing the transaction trail. He exhaled slowly. They made it personal. The world had not yet heard what happened. French media called it a minor incident, and government officials scrambled to control the narrative. But inside that bunker, Traoré was already plotting his response. Not one of rage, but of exposure. They wanted to kill me quietly, he said. Now they'll be unmasked, publicly, globally. His voice sharpened. Bring me every link to that corporation. Every name. Every document. We're going to the UN, not to ask for justice, but to reveal betrayal. The war wasn't over. It had just changed battlefield. This time, Traoré wouldn't dodge bullets. He'd fire back, with truth. The digital forensic team worked through the night. In the dim-lit room lined with servers, screens flickered with layers of financial trails and encrypted communications. What began as an attempted assassination had now erupted into a geopolitical scandal. The files uncovered on the soldiers' USB included flight records, coded emails, and damning video conferences. One frame stood out, a man in a navy blue suit with a red tie speaking in French, yet his English-accented French betrayed him. Behind him, the logo of Voltrex Energy Internationale pulsed on a glass screen. The same company Traoré had expelled from Burkina Faso 6 months earlier. This is the smoking gun, whispered Mori, pausing the video as the executive said, remove the obstacle. Any means necessary. Meanwhile, the soldier remained stoic in his holding cell, refusing food, speaking no more. His silence spoke louder than any confession. He had been trained, indoctrinated, and most likely paid well to vanish into disgrace. But Traoré wasn't focused on vengeance. He was focused on truth. At dawn, he stood before a private audience of African ambassadors, handing each a classified dossier containing evidence. What happened to me could happen to any of us, he said. If we do not stand united against exploitation masked as diplomacy, we will always be pawns in their game. His words echoed like fire in the marble chamber. For the first time in decades, the African bloc in Paris stood aligned, not just in outrage, but in action. As Traoré exited the embassy, a French journalist pushed through the crowd. Mr. President, are you accusing France of orchestrating your assassination? The cameras swiveled, silence falling like snow. Traoré didn't flinch. No, he replied calmly. But I am accusing powerful French interests of trying to silence an African voice they no longer control. And I have proof. The moment hit international headlines within minutes. Hashtags erupted. Protesters gathered in front of Voltrex headquarters, demanding answers. The French president called an emergency press briefing, denying involvement. But the world had already begun to shift. Africa, once viewed as a stage for silent exploitation, had just spoken through Traoré, and the world was listening. That evening, inside the UN's private high-security vault, copies of the USB data were submitted to the Global Committee on Security Violations. The move stunned European diplomats. No African leader had ever brought such direct accusations backed by verifiable evidence to the chamber. A former intelligence analyst who reviewed the footage called it the clearest case of covert economic warfare he'd seen in his career. Yet Traoré remained composed. Let them panic, he said to Mori, watching news anchors debate France's credibility. They sent a soldier to silence me, but I'll use their own files to awaken nations. His next step was bold, dangerous, and unprecedented, to call for a global tribunal, on camera. At sunrise, President Traoré appeared live from Ouagadougou. No podium. No grand hall. Just him, seated at a wooden desk beneath a simple light, with a Burkinabe flag behind him. Millions tuned in, expecting a condemnation. What they got instead was a proposition. To the world, he began, his voice steady and raw, we have entered a new era. not of war but of truth. I hereby call for an international tribunal on foreign interference in African sovereignty, beginning with the attempt on my life." He looked into the lens as if addressing every African child, mother, and elder watching. "Let this not be a moment of vengeance, but of memory. We will remember who tried to erase us." The message reverberated across every continent. In France, the response was chaos. Parliament broke into emergency session. Newspapers ran front pages titled "France Accused," and corporate heads scrambled. Voltrex's CEO issued a trembling denial on live TV. "We had no knowledge of such actions. We operate independently of military channels." But behind the scenes, investigators leaked internal memos, proof of covert financing tied to paramilitary units. It was no longer a matter of denial. It was about containment. Across Africa, students marched in solidarity. Artists painted murals of Traoré as a lion guarding the continent. His calm strength had turned attempted murder into a rallying cry for justice. Meanwhile, in Geneva, UN delegates debated the unprecedented request. A tribunal had never been formed at the demand of a single African nation, especially not to investigate a G7 power. But times had changed. Brazil voiced support first. Then India. Then a surprising third, Canada. "Justice does not wear colonial colors," said their representative. "It listens to the wounded, no matter how powerful the accused." For the first time in decades, a movement had ignited where Africa wasn't the topic of pity, but the source of principle. As Traoré's word spread, world leaders realized they were witnessing something rare: the birth of a new global alignment. That night, as the lights in Ouagadougou dimmed, a child approached Traoré's convoy holding a handmade sign, "Thank you for not being afraid." Traoré paused, stepped out, and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Courage," he whispered, "is knowing fear and walking forward anyway." The image was captured and posted everywhere. In Europe, think tanks scrambled to predict what a global tribunal could mean. In Africa, hope grew stronger than fear. And in the dark corners of power, those who once moved pawns in silence now found themselves in full light. Seen, challenged, and for the first time, afraid. Within a week, Ouagadougou had transformed. The Grand National Theatre, once reserved for concerts and speeches, had been retrofitted into a tribunal hall. But this would not be a trial behind closed doors. Traoré made one demand clear: the world must watch. Cameras were mounted on every wall. Interpreters stood ready in 8 languages. And as the first hearing began, the accused, a captured mercenary with ties to a French special unit, was brought in shackled but unharmed. He refused to speak, but his silence said enough. The documents presented by Burkina Faso's legal team, some smuggled from Paris by a brave journalist, painted a damning picture. Not of France as a nation, but of an elite cabal operating above law, commerce, and ethics. The tribunal's opening statement stunned the world. "This is not vengeance," said Chief Prosecutor Diabate, her voice thunderous and precise. "This is accountability. This is what sovereignty looks like." The audience, both local citizens and international guests, rose to their feet in a rare standing ovation during a court proceeding. Traoré watched from a private chamber, not interfering, not speaking. His silence had become more powerful than any speech. French media tried to discredit the process, calling it spectacle justice, but leaked footage of paid assassins receiving crypto payments traced to European bank accounts left critics scrambling. Public opinion shifted. The people no longer asked if there had been a conspiracy. They asked who else was involved. Outside the courthouse, massive murals appeared overnight. One showed Traoré shielding a bleeding Africa beneath his coat. Another depicted a chessboard where a single black pawn knocked over a golden king. Children lit candles every night, forming stars in the dirt. In South Africa, Kenya, Haiti, Brazil, and beyond, people began organizing watch parties to stream the tribunal. A poet in Ghana said, "We used to dream of independence. Today, we watch it stand trial in real time. The tribunal had become more than justice for Traoré. It was a reckoning for 500 years of shadows. And each day, more witnesses volunteered to testify. Then came the first unexpected twist. The French soldier finally spoke. 3 words. "I was ordered." The courtroom froze. Gasps spread like wildfire. Prosecutor Diabate leaned forward. Ordered by whom? But he said nothing more. Still, it was enough. Because now, the world demanded names. The momentum was unstoppable, and for the first time in decades, the balance of power trembled. No longer was Africa pleading for respect. It was demanding answers, with the full force of truth behind it. The silence of the assassin had been broken, and now a torrent followed. International journalists, once hesitant, began releasing classified documents. A whistleblower from within a European intelligence service came forward, anonymously providing a list of names. It included not just rogue soldiers or private contractors, but diplomats, CEOs, and even 2 sitting members of the European Parliament. The courtroom's atmosphere was electric. Every hour, new details emerged. Emails, wire transfers, phone logs. The dots were connecting faster than anyone could prepare for, and they all pointed to one goal: destabilize Traoré before his Pan-African coalition could take root. What had begun as a trial of one man was now a trial of history, empire, and greed. President Traoré remained calm amid the storm. In his nightly address to the people, always brief, always without teleprompter, he said, "This moment is not about me. It is about the dignity of every village, every grandmother, every child who has suffered under unseen hands." His words were broadcast in 47 countries, translated into 20 languages. In Paris, protests erupted. Young people flooded the streets with banners that read, "Pas en notre nom," not in our name. In Washington, a rare bipartisan statement condemned any foreign interference against African sovereignty. Even the United Nations, often slow to respond, requested a special council session to address the revelations. But Traoré did not wait for permission. He moved forward with precision and moral clarity. Back in the courtroom, a second soldier testified. He was not captured, he had defected. His testimony was explosive. "We were told Traoré was a threat to global order," he said, voice trembling. "We were told Africa should never have a single voice. But I saw his convoy feed children. I saw him shake hands with rebels and turn them into farmers." The court was silent. Traoré, watching from a monitor, closed his eyes. This was bigger than any one verdict. It was the beginning of a shift long overdue. And the more the world watched, the more undeniable the truth became. Traoré's vision terrified those who had long profited from a divided Africa. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou transformed into sacred ground. Artists painted walls with images of lions, doves, and broken chains. School children reenacted scenes from the trial in classrooms. A new generation was being born, not just of Burkinabe citizens, but of Africans who believed, for the first time in centuries, that unity was not a myth. It was a movement, and the courtroom, with every confession, was becoming a temple. A place where the continent had chosen to confront its demons, not with vengeance, but with vision. The courtroom trial took a new turn when a letter arrived from Mali. It was handwritten, folded in a leather pouch, and delivered by a young courier on horseback, a symbolic gesture that harkened back to pre-colonial times when African leaders communicated through trusted envoys, not encrypted emails. The letter bore the seal of a powerful tribal confederation that had remained neutral for decades. It began simply, "To President Traoré from the elders of the Sahel, we offer what France cannot, truth." The document included a list of secret meetings between French officials and mercenary groups operating in the region. Names, locations, dates, proof. As the letter was read aloud in court, the audience gasped. Even the prosecutor, until then skeptical of a broader conspiracy, dropped his pen. The connections were chilling. One of the meetings had taken place just 48 hours before the failed assassination. Another was allegedly attended by a French diplomat currently stationed in Niger. Traoré sat motionless, his hands folded. The courtroom had become a battleground of worlds, one old and decaying, desperate to cling to power, and one rising with the strength of ancestral roots and modern clarity. The judges called for a recess, but no one moved. The silence said everything. History was being rewritten in real time. News of the letter spread like wildfire. In Senegal, thousands marched holding candles in the dark. In Congo, women sang traditional warrior chants on national television. In South Africa, university students staged symbolic mock trials of colonial figures. And in France itself, protesters gathered at Place de la République, some wearing West African garments in solidarity. "We are not our ancestors' colonizers," one sign read. But others were less forgiving. In a video that went viral, a young activist declared, "This is not just about Africa, it's about the soul of humanity." Overnight, Traoré became not just a leader, but a living symbol of resistance and rebirth. Back in Burkina Faso, the president's security was tightened. Drone surveillance covered every inch of his movement, and an elite civilian defense unit patrolled in silence, armed but unafraid. Yet Traoré insisted on walking through the capital without armor, greeting children, visiting bakeries, speaking with teachers. "If I hide, they win," he told his staff. "If I live in fear, Africa dies in silence." That quote would appear on murals, t-shirts, and even currency within weeks. What the French soldier had failed to kill at the dinner table was now reborn in every African heart. Traoré had become more than a man. He was now the rhythm of a continent's heartbeat. Back in France, the Élysée Palace was in chaos. The leak of classified communications implicating French operatives had sparked outrage in the National Assembly. A secret parliamentary session was held, and for the first time in decades, politicians openly questioned the legitimacy of France's continued military presence in West Africa. The Prime Minister stammered through his statements while news outlets from Le Monde to Al Jazeera hammered the administration for its colonial echoes. Protesters surrounded French embassies in Ouagadougou and Bamako, demanding a full apology. Meanwhile, Traoré's decision to release the Mali letter publicly had proven masterful. It shifted the global narrative, transforming him from survivor to warrior statesman. But it wasn't only political shockwaves that rippled through Europe, it was fear. French intelligence began monitoring internal dissent, fearing whistleblowers within their own ranks. A second letter surfaced, this time from a retired colonel who admitted to helping coordinate logistics for Operation Mistral, an unofficial name for covert efforts to suppress Traoré's influence. According to the colonel, the plot wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about stopping the African revolution that Traoré represented. He was the spark they couldn't control, he wrote. That letter confirmed what many had already suspected. The assassination attempt was sanctioned at levels far higher than anyone had dared to believe. In Africa, however, the mood was the opposite. What had started as mourning had turned into a movement. Artists began creating powerful murals of Traoré with lion imagery, recalling the animal that once blocked the road and saved his life. A viral video showed a young girl in Sierra Leone reciting Traoré's quotes to her classmates. "He speaks the truth that even bullets can't silence," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. Pan-African coalitions were forming with new energy, and former rival nations began engaging in quiet diplomatic talks, all invoking the same name, Traoré. He had become more than a leader. He was now a cultural force. But Traoré himself remained grounded. In a quiet interview with an independent journalist from Togo, he was asked if he feared retaliation. He smiled, but it was the smile of a man who had lost brothers, who had walked alone through corridors of betrayal. "They tried to kill me because I refused to kneel," he said. "And because I will never kneel, they will try again. But I don't walk for myself anymore. I walk for the thousands they can't see, the millions they pretend don't exist." That line spread like wildfire, tattooed on arms, printed on banners, spoken in whispers across continents. France had tried to silence one man. Instead, they awakened a billion. While Traoré's quote reverberated through the streets of Accra, Dakar, and Harare, it reached the very heart of France as well. Young African-descendant citizens in Paris began marching, holding candles and portraits of Traoré. Chants of "Justice pour l'Afrique" echoed under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. The streets trembled not just with anger, but with clarity. These weren't radicals. They were students, professionals, nurses, engineers. People who had seen their heritage mocked, now saw a mirror of pride. Traoré, unknowingly, had become a living manifesto for Africans on every continent. The French government scrambled to contain the movement, issuing press statements, deploying riot control, but it was too late. The voice of Africa was no longer asking to be heard. It was demanding it. The French soldier who had attempted the assassination, Sergeant Adrien Beaumont, was arrested but portrayed in the French press as a rogue element. Yet leaks from the French Defense Ministry painted a different story. Beaumont had received encrypted instructions days before the attack, including escape protocols and contact points. And perhaps most damning, a memo surfaced detailing a Scenario Alpha, a hypothetical plan to replace Traoré with a French-approved interim stabilizer. The memo, signed by a senior official, was authenticated by investigative journalists. France had been caught red-handed. The damage was irreparable. African nations began severing military accords and canceling diplomatic summits. France, once the invisible hand in African affairs, now stood fully exposed. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré convened an emergency summit with neighboring leaders. The room was filled with silence, not out of fear, but respect. When he stood, his words were simple, deliberate. This is not an African problem. This is a global sickness. Colonialism didn't die. It changed names, uniforms, contracts. Today we end the disguise. The room erupted in applause. That very day, leaders from 8 countries signed the Ouagadougou Accord, a pact to remove all foreign military bases within 5 years and establish a Pan-African Defense Union. It wasn't just policy, it was a signal. Africa would never again bow in silence. And as if fate were scripting history, that night a solar eclipse darkened the skies over West Africa. Millions stepped outside to witness it. In villages and capitals alike, families stood together, faces turned to the heavens. Some whispered prayers. Others recited Traoré's words. One elder in Ghana reportedly said, "The darkness does not mean defeat. It means the sun is resting before it rises stronger." The symbolism was undeniable. Traoré's near death had lit a fire, and now the world watched Africa, not as a continent of crisis, but as a continent of courage. A continent no longer willing to die quietly. In the days following the solar eclipse, Ibrahim Traoré's voice echoed across continents. He appeared live before the Pan-African Union, not from a presidential podium, but seated among children in a rural school. Behind him was a chalkboard with only 2 words written in white, "Never again." Cameras captured the raw simplicity of the scene. No flags, no guards, no symbols of power. Just truth. "They tried to kill me because I refused to let them kill you," he said to the children. The world held its breath. "If I must fall, I will fall forward, so my body becomes a bridge for your future." The silence in the room was heavy, sacred. A child reached for his hand, and history reached for his legacy. International media scrambled to redefine their narrative. Once ridiculed or dismissed as a populist, Traoré was now being studied in universities, quoted in parliaments, and honored in murals from Johannesburg to Rio de Janeiro. In Paris, anti-colonial protests surged with a new wave of force. French politicians attempted damage control, but the trust was broken beyond repair. The failed assassination had not only failed, it had fueled a movement too vast to contain. African youth wore shirts that read, "They missed the shot. But we saw the truth." Artists painted scenes of Traoré wrestling with lions, standing between shadows and sunrise. The myth had been born, but it wasn't fiction. It was faith turned into flesh. France was forced to open investigations into their military command. International courts issued inquiries. And for the first time in decades, a sitting African president gave testimony not as the accused, but as the aggrieved. In The Hague, Ibrahim stood tall, unshaken. When asked if he held hatred for those who tried to kill him, he simply responded, "No. Hatred is what poisoned them. We will not drink from the same cup." That single sentence went viral. In cafes, in classrooms, even among diplomats, he was no longer seen as just a leader. He was a philosopher of justice, a revolutionary of mercy, and above all, a guardian of his people's dignity. On the one-year anniversary of the attempt on his life, thousands marched peacefully through Ouagadougou. Candles lit every window, and choirs sang under the stars. In the capital square, a bronze statue was unveiled, not of Traoré, but of a lion standing watch over a group of children. At its base, carved into stone, were his words, "Let them come with bullets, we will answer with vision." Ibrahim stood in the crowd, unnoticed by many, hand in hand with his mother. As fireworks lit up the sky, a reporter asked him what he hoped for next. He smiled and said, "For my people to realize they were never colonized in the soul, only distracted." And with that, the world knew Africa had not only survived the shot, it had awakened. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.